In this video, we are going to see the contextual forms of the Arabic letters. We will see that the letters can be written in different forms at the beginning, at the middle, or at the end of the word. I will take each letter separately and show you how to write it at each position. In the next slides, we will have a writing practice, and this will be clarified even more. So let's start by the letters. The first column herein represents how to write the letter in the isolated form, the ones that we saw at the beginning of this course. Then we will see how to write it in the initial position at the beginning of each word. Then we will see how to write it in the middle, and finally at the end of the word. So the first letter is Alif. We see how to write it in isolated form as we have seen it previously. At the beginning of the word, we write it exactly the same as the isolated form. Here I used the red dash to represent the following letter, as well as I will use it to represent the preceding letter. Please note that after the alif, we have always a space, but before it, we can connect it by a dash with the preceding letter, which is here represented, as I said, by the red dash. At the end, it's exactly the same as the middle. The B is written as we see it in the screen in isolated form. At the beginning of the word, we write half of it, so the beginning is exactly the same. The dot is shifted a little to the right, and then comes the next letter represented by the red dash. At the middle, we have two dashes, one to the right, one to the left, so there's no space. And we write the same beginning of the B. At the end, we write exactly the same as the isolated form, but we add a dash which comes from the preceding letter. The T is exactly the same as the B, so instead we put just double points at the top of the letter. In the middle, it's the same also. We have a preceding letter and a following letter. And at the end, we write the isolated form and we just add a dash before it. The Tha is also the same, but with 3 points instead of 2 points. And here we see the same beginning, the middle is the same, and the end is the same as the isolated form. Next letter is Jim. At the beginning, we write the first part of it, so we don't continue downward. At the middle, we have the same as the beginning, but with two connections, one to the right, one to the left. And the end, we write the isolated form, but with a connection with the preceding letter. Ha is exactly the same, but without a dot. So at the beginning, it's exactly the same as G, but without a dot. At the middle, it's the same. And at the end, we write the isolated form. Kha is exactly the same, but the dot is above the letter instead of below it. And at the beginning, we write it the same way. The middle is the same also. And at the end, we write the isolated form with a connection with the preceding letter. The next letter is Dal. At the beginning, we write it exactly the same as the isolated form. So the following letter doesn't have a connection with it. At the middle, we write just a connection with the preceding letter. And again, following it, there is just a space. And at the end, it's just the isolated form with a connection before it. Dal is exactly the same as the dal, but with a point above it. So it will be written exactly the same way in the initial form, then the middle the same, and exactly the same in the final. Ra, also similar to the preceding letters. So we have at the beginning, we write it exactly as in the isolated form. We have a space after it, then comes the next letter. At the middle of the word, we write the isolated form and preceding by it a dash, representing the connection with the previous letter. At the end, it's exactly the same as the middle. The Zay is exactly the same as the R, but with a dot above it, so it will be written exactly the same way. The Sin, we write only the beginning part of the isolated form. So it has 3 vertical dashes that are very small. At the middle, we have 2 connections, one to the right, one to the left. And at the end, we write the isolated form and preceding it a dash. Sheen is exactly the same as the Sin, but with 3 dots above it. So it will be written exactly the same way in all the forms. So initial, middle, and final. Sod is also similar to the seen and sheen. So we write only the beginning part of it. Please note that after the initial form, we have a small dash. At the middle, it's also the same, but adding another dash preceding it. And at the end, we write the isolated form. Bod is similar to sod, but with a dot above it. So it will be written in the same way at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end. Ta is easier than the sod and dod. So at the beginning, we write it exactly the same way with a dash following it. At the middle, we add a dash before it. And at the end, we write the isolated form with a dash preceding. Dha is exactly the same with a dot above it. So it will be written exactly the same way at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end. For the ayn, we start by writing the initial part of the isolated form, followed by a dash. At the middle, it changes a little, so it's like closing the beginning of the circle and connecting it to the preceding letter. At the end, we can write it exactly as the isolated form, but with a dash preceding dash, or we can close the circle. We will have a look in the writing session to clarify this issue. Ghain is exactly the same as the ayn, but with a dot above it. So in the initial, it's the same way, at the middle, and at the end. For the fa, we write the beginning part of the letter, followed by a dash. For the middle, we have two dashes, one representing the previous letter and one representing the following letter. At the end, we write the isolated form preceded by a dash. The qaf is similar to the fa, but two dots instead of one. So it will be written the same way at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end. Kaf is a different letter, so at the beginning, the form changes a little. So it's written in this way, followed by a dash. And the middle, it's similar to the initial form, but with a dash preceding. And at the end, as usual, we write the isolated form preceded by a dash. Lam, we write it at the beginning as the alif, but without a space after it, but a connection with the next letter. In the middle part, we write exactly the same as the initial one, but with a dash preceding. At the end, we write the isolated form and connected by the previous letter. The next letter is mim, so we start by writing the beginning of the isolated form, then connected by a dash. The initial form appears to look different from the isolated form, but in reality it's exactly the same way, but with a dash following it. We will see this in the writing session. At the middle, it's similar to the initial form, but with a connection with the preceding letter. At the end, we write the isolated form preceded by a dash. Noon, we write it similar to how we wrote the B and the T and the Tha. So we start the beginning of the letter like that with a dot above it. At the middle is the same way with a dash preceding it. And at the end, we use the isolated form plus a dash preceding it. For the Ha, we write it the same way as the isolated form at the beginning. At the middle, it's written a little different way, although we can write it exactly the same as the initial form, but with a dash preceding it. At the end, we write it also again different. We write somehow a circle connected to a vertical dash. For the waw, we write it similar to ra and zay. So at the beginning, we write the isolated form followed by a space, then the next letter. At the middle, we write a dash before it. And at the end, similar to the middle form. And finally, for the ya, we write it similar to B and T, the same way, but two dots below it. At the middle, we have the same form as the initial one, but with a dash preceding it. And at the end, we write the isolated form with a dash preceding it. For the special form of the T here written in green, because it's not a letter, it's just the T in a different form, so it's the circle with two dots above it. we already said that it doesn't come at the initial place or the middle place, only at the end, and it's written either similar to the isolated form or similar to the ha sound, the H, with two dots above it.